Jacob Wallace was the embodiment of success. At just 45, he had built an empire from the ground up, transforming a modest startup into a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate. His name was synonymous with power and influence in the business world. But this success came at a cost he rarely allowed himself to think about. The early morning sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office in downtown Manhattan. Jacob sat at his desk, eyes scanning through the endless stream of emails and reports that filled his inbox. The office was a reflection of his life, sleek, modern, and meticulously organized. Every detail was perfect, from the expensive artwork on the walls to the polished marble floors. Yet, despite the opulence, there was a coldness to the space, much like the man who occupied it. Jacob had always been driven, even as a child. Born into a modest family in a small town in Ohio, he learned early on that the only way to escape a life of mediocrity was through sheer determination and hard work. And so, he buried himself in his studies, sacrificing friendships, relationships, and anything else that might distract him from his goal. His focus was unwavering, his ambition limitless. He graduated at the top of his class, quickly rising through the ranks of the corporate world until he was in a position to start his own company. Over the years, Jacob's obsession with success only grew. He became known as a ruthless businessman, someone who would stop at nothing to achieve his objectives. Deals were made and broken, competitors were crushed, and alliances were formed, all in the name of expanding his empire. But as the years passed, something else was expanding too: the emptiness inside him. Despite his wealth and power, Jacob's personal life was a void. His relationships were superficial, often transactional, and he had long since stopped making time for anything that didn't serve his business interests. The only calls he received were from colleagues or the few friends who remained, all of whom were connected to his work. His life had become a series of meetings, deals, and acquisitions, with no room for anything or anyone else. That morning, as Jacob reviewed the latest quarterly earnings, a rare moment of reflection passed over him. He glanced at the corner of his desk where a small, dusty photo frame stood. Inside was a picture of him with his parents, taken years ago at a family gathering. They were smiling, proud of their son's accomplishments. But the image felt foreign to Jacob, like it belonged to someone else. He couldn't remember the last time he had spoken to them, and he knew that his success had come at the expense of his relationship with them. Jacob shook off the thought and refocused on his work. Emotions were a weakness, something he couldn't afford. He was a man with a mission, and nothing could distract him from it. Or so he believed. Later that day, after closing a particularly challenging deal, Jacob left his office for a rare walk through the city. The crisp autumn air was a welcome change from the sterile environment of his office. As he walked, he noticed the world around him, people chatting, children playing, couples holding hands. It was a world he was no longer part of, a world he had long since traded for boardrooms and conference calls. But Jacob didn't dwell on these thoughts. He had made his choices, and he was living the life he had always wanted. Or so he told himself. As he approached the entrance of a sleek black car waiting to take him to his next meeting, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing, something he couldn't quite name. But just as quickly as the feeling came, he dismissed it. There was no time for doubts. Success was all that mattered. And yet, despite his best efforts to bury his emotions, a seed of unease had been planted in Jacob's mind. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it was there, waiting to grow. And as he would soon discover, that tiny seed would change his life in ways he could never have imagined. Jacob stepped out of the sleek black sedan and onto the bustling sidewalk, the sounds of the city enveloping him in their familiar chaos. His day had been a blur of meetings and negotiations, and the sun was already beginning its descent, casting long shadows across the cityscape. He adjusted his tailored suit, preparing to head into a nearby cafe for a brief respite before his next appointment. As he made his way toward the entrance, his thoughts were still consumed by the details of the latest deal he had brokered. The world around him was little more than background noise, a blur of faces and activity that barely registered. But as he reached for the door, something, or rather, someone, caught his attention. A small voice, clear and innocent, pierced through the haze of his thoughts. "Excuse me, mister." Jacob turned, slightly surprised to find a young girl standing just a few feet away. She couldn't have been more than 6 or 7 years old, with big, curious eyes that peered up at him from beneath a mop of unruly chestnut curls. She was dressed in a simple pink jacket and jeans, holding a small stuffed bunny by its worn ear. "Yes," Jacob replied, his voice automatically slipping into the polite yet distant tone he reserved for strangers. He was already calculating how much time this interaction might cost him. The girl tilted her head slightly, studying him with a seriousness that seemed far beyond her years. "I know you," she said with a soft certainty. "Your picture is in my mommy's purse." Jacob froze, the girl's words hanging in the air between them. For a moment, he was too stunned to respond. "In your mommy's purse?" he echoed, trying to process what she had just said. He wasn't a man who was easily rattled, but this small child's statement had thrown him off balance. The girl nodded, her expression unwavering. "Yeah, mommy looks at it sometimes. She says you're important." The weight of her words settled on Jacob, bringing with it a flood of questions. He knelt down to be at eye level with her, suddenly needing to understand more. "What's your name?" he asked gently. "Lily," she replied with a small smile, her grip tightening on the stuffed bunny. "And your mommy, what's her name?" Jacob's heart was beating faster now, an unfamiliar sensation that he couldn't quite place. "Lily," a woman's voice called out, filled with both relief and a hint of panic. Jacob looked up to see a woman rushing toward them, her face flushed with concern. She was around his age, with dark hair that framed her face in soft waves. Her eyes, wide with worry, locked onto Lily as she reached her and pulled her into a protective embrace. "I'm so sorry," the woman said breathlessly, glancing up at Jacob. "She has a habit of wandering off. I hope she didn't bother you." Jacob stood, his mind still reeling. "No, not at all," he managed, his voice surprisingly calm. "She's quite something." The woman gave a small, apologetic smile before turning her attention back to her daughter. "Lily, you can't just run off like that, okay? You scared me." "But mommy," Lily protested, looking up at her mother with innocent eyes. "This is the man in your picture. The one you said was important." The woman's expression changed instantly, a look of shock and something else. Something Jacob couldn't quite identify, crossing her face. She quickly looked away, as if trying to hide her reaction. "Lily, that's enough," she said softly but firmly. "Let's go." Jacob felt a surge of urgency, a need to understand what was happening. "Wait," he called out, taking a step forward. The woman hesitated, her back still turned to him. "Please," he added, his voice softer now, almost pleading. "Who are you?" For a long moment, the woman didn't move. Then, slowly, she turned around to face him, her eyes meeting his with a mix of fear and resignation. "My name is Emily," she said quietly. "Emily Collins." Jacob's breath caught in his throat. The name echoed in his mind, dredging up memories he had long buried. Memories of a time when he wasn't the man he was now, when he still allowed himself to care about something other than his career. Before he could say anything, Emily tightened her grip on Lily's hand and began to walk away, quickly disappearing into the crowd. Jacob stood there, rooted to the spot, his mind racing with the implications of what had just happened. The city continued to move around him, indifferent to the storm brewing inside his head. But Jacob knew that his life had just taken an unexpected turn, one that would force him to confront a past he thought he had left behind. Jacob stood frozen on the bustling sidewalk, watching Emily and Lily disappear into the crowd. The sounds of the city faded into a distant hum as his mind struggled to piece together what had just happened. Emily Collins, her name echoed in his thoughts, stirring up memories that he had buried deep within him. It had been over a decade since Jacob last thought about Emily. They had met during the early days of his career, back when he was still climbing the corporate ladder, full of ambition but not yet consumed by it. Emily had been a bright, passionate young woman working in the same building. Their connection was immediate and intense, fueled by long conversations and shared dreams. But as Jacob's career began to skyrocket, his priorities shifted. He started spending more time at the office, working late nights and weekends, while Emily grew increasingly frustrated with his absence. Eventually, their relationship crumbled under the weight of his ambition. They parted ways, and Jacob threw himself even deeper into his work, determined to succeed at any cost. But now, standing in the middle of the street, Jacob felt a wave of regret wash over him. He had always assumed that chapter of his life was closed, but Lily's innocent words had shattered that illusion. Could he really have a daughter? The thought both thrilled and terrified him. Jacob snapped out of his reverie and quickly turned back to the cafe. He needed answers. He needed to know more about Emily, about Lily, about the life that could have been his. Without thinking, he pulled out his phone and dialed a number. "James, it's Jacob," he said as soon as his assistant picked up. "I need you to find someone for me. Her name is Emily Collins. She's someone from my past." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line before James responded. "I'll get right on it, Mr. Wallace. Do you have any more details?" Jacob hesitated. "She might still live in the city, and she has a daughter named Lily, about 6 or 7 years old. I need this done quickly." "Understood," James replied, his voice professional and efficient. "I'll have an update for you by the end of the day." Jacob ended the call and took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He wasn't used to feeling this way, uncertain, vulnerable. It was a stark contrast to the confidence he exuded in boardrooms and negotiations. But this was different. This was personal. As the day dragged on, Jacob found it impossible to focus on work. His thoughts kept drifting back to Emily and the life she might have lived after they parted ways. Had she moved on quickly? Had she found happiness? And most importantly, was Lily really his daughter? That evening, James called with the information Jacob had been anxiously awaiting. "I found her, sir," he said. "Emily Collins lives in a modest apartment in Brooklyn. She works as a freelance graphic designer. It seems like she's been living there for a few years." "And Lily?" Jacob asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Lily Collins, age 7, attends a nearby elementary school. There's no record of a father on any official documents. It's just the two of them." Jacob's heart pounded in his chest. The possibility that Lily could be his daughter felt more real now, but it also brought a heavy burden. If she was his child, what did that mean? How would he fit in her life after all this time? And what would Emily say when he confronted her? "Thank you, James," Jacob said, his voice tight with emotion. "That will be all for now." After the call, Jacob sat alone in his penthouse, the city lights flickering outside his window. He poured himself a drink, hoping it would calm his nerves, but it did little to ease the turmoil inside him. He knew he had to talk to Emily, to understand what had happened, but the thought of facing her after all these years filled him with dread. The next morning, Jacob found himself driving to Brooklyn, his hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than usual. The streets were quieter here, a stark contrast to the frenetic pace of Manhattan. As he parked outside Emily's apartment building, he took a moment to collect his thoughts. This was it. There was no turning back now. He climbed the steps to her building, each one feeling heavier than the last. When he reached her door, he hesitated for a moment, his hand hovering over the doorbell. What if she didn't want to see him? What if she had moved on completely and didn't want him in her life? Or Lily's? But Jacob knew he had to face the past, no matter how painful. He rang the doorbell and waited, his heart pounding in his chest. A few seconds later, the door opened, and there she was, Emily, looking just as he remembered, yet somehow different. Her eyes widened in surprise when she saw him. "Jacob," she breathed, her voice filled with a mix of shock and something else, something that made Jacob's heart ache. "Emily," he replied, his voice barely steady. "We need to talk." The silence between Jacob and Emily was thick with tension as they stood in the doorway of her modest Brooklyn apartment. Emily's eyes, wide with shock, locked onto his, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. It was as if time had frozen, trapping them in a moment that neither could fully comprehend. Finally, Emily broke the silence, her voice barely above a whisper. "What are you doing here, Jacob?" Jacob hesitated, the weight of the past pressing heavily on his shoulders. "I met Lily yesterday," he began, his voice trembling slightly. She told me something that I need to understand. Emily, I need to know the truth." Emily's expression hardened, and she crossed her arms defensively. What truth, Jacob? You walked away from that life a long time ago. Why does it matter now? Jacob winced at the coldness in her voice, but he pushed forward, determined to get the answers he needed. Lily said she knows me from a picture in your purse. She said I'm important. Emily, is she my daughter? Emily's face softened for a brief moment, a flicker of pain passing through her eyes before she looked away. You should come inside, she said quietly, stepping aside to let him in. Jacob followed her into the apartment, his heart racing. The space was small but warm, filled with the signs of a loving home. Children's drawings adorned the walls, and a few toys were scattered across the floor. It was a stark contrast to his cold, sterile penthouse, and for a moment, Jacob felt a pang of something he hadn't felt in years: regret. Emily led him to the small living room, where they both sat down on the worn couch. She took a deep breath before speaking. Lily doesn't know much about you, Jacob. She's only seen the picture, and I've told her that you're someone I used to know. But yes, she's your daughter. The words hit Jacob like a freight train, and he struggled to process them. Why didn't you tell me? He asked, his voice a mixture of hurt and confusion. Emily looked down at her hands, her fingers twisting together nervously. I wanted to at first, she admitted. When I found out I was pregnant, I was scared, but I thought you had a right to know. But every time I tried to reach out, you were too busy, too wrapped up in your work. It was like you'd already made your choice, Jacob. You chose your career over everything else. Jacob opened his mouth to protest, but the words caught in his throat. Deep down, he knew she was right. He had been so focused on his success that he had shut out everything and everyone else. Emily continued, her voice tinged with bitterness. After a while, I realized that I didn't want to force you into something you didn't want. I decided it was better for Lily to grow up without the chaos, without feeling like she wasn't a priority. So I made the decision to raise her on my own. Jacob's heart ached as he listened to her. I didn't know, he said quietly, the regret in his voice unmistakable. I didn't know any of this, Emily. If I had known. But you didn't, Emily interrupted, her tone firm. You didn't know because you weren't there. And now you show up, years later, expecting what? To just step into Lily's life like nothing happened? Jacob shook his head, overwhelmed by guilt. I don't know what I expected, he admitted, but I can't just walk away from this. She's my daughter, Emily. I want to be part of her life. Emily looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and anger. You think you can just waltz in and make up for lost time? It doesn't work that way, Jacob. Lily doesn't even know who you are. She doesn't need a father who's only there when it's convenient. Jacob felt a wave of shame wash over him. I know I've made mistakes, he said, his voice barely steady. But I'm here now, and I want to do what's right. Please, Emily, give me a chance. Emily stared at him for a long moment, the conflict evident in her eyes. Finally, she sighed, the fight seeming to drain out of her. It's not that simple, she said softly. You can't just undo the past. But maybe we can figure something out. For Lily's sake. Jacob nodded, relief mingled with uncertainty. I'll do whatever it takes, he promised. Emily studied him, searching his face for sincerity. I don't know how this will work, she admitted. But if you're serious about being in her life, you need to understand that it won't be easy. You've missed so much, Jacob. And Lily, she's just a little girl. She doesn't understand the complexities of all this. Jacob leaned forward, his eyes filled with determination. I'm ready to try, he said. I know I've made mistakes, but I want to be there for her now. I want to get to know my daughter. Emily looked at him, a hint of hope flickering in her eyes. Then we'll take it one step at a time, she said. But don't make promises you can't keep, Jacob. Lily deserves better than that. Jacob nodded, his heart heavy with the weight of the past and the uncertainty of the future. He knew this was just the beginning of a long and difficult journey, but for the first time in years, he felt like he was on the right path. As he left Emily's apartment that day, Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. But one thing was clear. He wasn't going to let this second chance slip away. The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotions for Jacob. The revelation that he had a daughter, a daughter he had never known, shook him to his core. He couldn't stop thinking about Lily, about the life she had lived without him, and about the years he had lost. His mind was a storm of regret, guilt, and an overwhelming desire to make things right. Jacob started visiting Emily and Lily regularly, each visit a cautious step into the unknown. He was determined to rebuild what he had never known he lost, but it was clear that this would be no easy task. Lily was a sweet, curious child, but there was a distance between them, a gap that Jacob didn't know how to bridge. She was polite, even warm at times, but there was a guardedness in her eyes, a sign that she wasn't sure what to make of this man who had suddenly appeared in her life. One Saturday afternoon, as they sat in the small park near Emily's apartment, Lily was drawing in a sketchbook while Jacob watched, unsure of how to start a conversation that didn't feel forced. He admired the way her brow furrowed in concentration as she carefully colored in the lines. It reminded him of Emily when she used to paint in her spare time. "Do you like to draw, Lily?" Jacob asked, trying to sound casual. Lily nodded without looking up. "Mommy says I'm good at it. She says I get it from her." Jacob smiled, though it was tinged with sadness. "Your mom is very talented," he said softly. "I remember when she used to paint all the time." Lily glanced up at him, her eyes filled with curiosity. "Did you know Mommy when she painted?" "I did," Jacob replied, his voice steady despite the emotions swirling inside him. "We used to spend a lot of time together a long time ago." Lily seemed to ponder this for a moment before going back to her drawing. Jacob felt the familiar ache of time lost and words unsaid, but he pushed it aside. He had to focus on the present. Later that evening, after Lily had gone to bed, Jacob and Emily sat in the living room, the weight of the day's events hanging heavily between them. The television was on, but neither of them was paying attention. "She's warming up to you," Emily said quietly, breaking the silence. Jacob nodded, though he wasn't entirely convinced. "I hope so," he replied. "It's just there's so much I don't know. About her, about you." Emily sighed, her expression softening. "It's not going to happen overnight, Jacob. You can't just walk into someone's life and expect everything to fall into place." "I know," Jacob said, frustration creeping into his voice. "But I'm trying, Emily. I really am." Emily studied him for a moment before speaking again. "I know you are, and I appreciate that. But there's something we need to talk about. Something you don't know." Jacob's heart skipped a beat. "What is it?" Emily hesitated, her hands twisting together in her lap. "It's about why we broke up," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "There's more to the story than you think." Jacob leaned forward, his pulse quickening. "What do you mean?" Emily took a deep breath, as if gathering the strength to continue. "Jacob, someone came between us. It wasn't just the distance or the work. There was a person who made sure we wouldn't stay together." Jacob's mind raced, trying to make sense of her words. "Who? Who would do something like that?" "James," Emily whispered, her eyes filling with tears. "Your assistant. He told me things, lies about you. He made me believe you didn't care, that you had moved on. He even sent me fake messages from you, saying you were seeing someone else." Jacob felt the blood drain from his face. "James? My James? That doesn't make any sense. Why would he do that?" "Because he wanted to protect you," Emily said bitterly. "He thought I was a distraction, that I would ruin your chances of success. He manipulated everything, Jacob. He made sure I wouldn't come back." Jacob's hands clenched into fists, rage and disbelief warring within him. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" he asked, his voice shaking. "I tried," Emily said, wiping a tear from her cheek. "But by the time I realized what had happened, it was too late. You were already gone, and I didn't think you'd believe me if I came back into your life out of the blue." Jacob felt as though the ground had been pulled out from under him. The man he had trusted for years, the man who had been by his side through every major decision, had betrayed him in the worst possible way. I can't believe this," he stammered. "How could he do this to me? To us?" Emily reached out, placing a hand on his arm. "Jacob, I know this is a lot to take in, but you need to understand that it wasn't your fault. You were deceived just like I was." Jacob looked at her, the pain and betrayal etched on his face. "I've lost so much time," he whispered, the weight of his words sinking in. "I could have been there for you, for Lily." Emily nodded, her own tears falling freely now. "But you're here now, Jacob. We can't change the past, but we can try to build something for the future." Jacob closed his eyes, trying to steady his breathing. He felt like his world was crumbling around him, but Emily's words anchored him to the present. He had been given a second chance, one that he couldn't afford to waste. When Jacob finally opened his eyes, he met Emily's gaze with a newfound determination. "I'm going to make this right," he said firmly. "I don't know how, but I'm going to make this right. For you and for Lily." Emily gave him a small, sad smile. "We'll take it one day at a time," she said softly. "That's all we can do." As they sat together in the dimly lit living room, the enormity of what had been revealed settled over them. It was a moment of reckoning, a turning point that would shape the course of their lives. And for the first time in years, Jacob felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time: hope. The days after the revelation were a blur for Jacob. The betrayal by James weighed heavily on him. But even more pressing was the need to reconnect with Lily and build the relationship he had never had. He knew he couldn't erase the past, but he was determined to carve out a place in her life, no matter how difficult the journey might be. Jacob began spending more time with Lily, carefully trying to weave himself into the fabric of her daily life. He joined her and Emily for simple outings, trips to the park, visits to the library, and quiet afternoons spent drawing or reading together. Each moment, however small, was an opportunity for Jacob to earn Lily's trust, and he approached it with a mixture of hope and anxiety. One evening, after a day filled with laughter and shared stories, Jacob found himself alone with Lily as Emily stepped out to run a quick errand. They sat together at the kitchen table, the fading light of dusk casting a soft glow through the window. Lily was engrossed in a puzzle, her small hands carefully fitting the pieces together, while Jacob watched her with a quiet intensity. "You're really good at that," Jacob said, breaking the comfortable silence. "I used to love puzzles when I was your age." Lily glanced up at him, her expression thoughtful. "Did you do them with your daddy?" Jacob hesitated, caught off guard by the question. "No," he replied gently. "I didn't get to spend much time with my dad. He was always busy with work, kind of like how I used to be." Lily's brow furrowed as she considered his words. "Why were you so busy?" Jacob sighed, searching for the right way to explain. "I thought that being successful and working hard was the most important thing in the world," he said slowly. "But now I realize that I missed out on things that matter a lot more, like spending time with the people I care about." Lily studied him for a moment before returning to her puzzle. "Mommy says that spending time with people is more important than anything else," she said, her voice soft but sure. Jacob felt a pang of regret, but he smiled. "Your mommy is very smart," he said, "and she's right." Lily didn't say anything, but Jacob could see the wheels turning in her mind. He knew that trust wouldn't come easily, that he would have to earn it piece by piece, just like the puzzle she was working on. But he was willing to be patient, to take it slowly and show Lily that he was there to stay. As the weeks passed, Jacob's relationship with Lily began to take shape. It was fragile, like a delicate flower slowly blooming after a long winter, but it was real. They shared more conversations, more moments of connection, and slowly, Lily started to open up to him. She would show him her drawings, ask him questions about his life, and even hold his hand when they walked together in the park. But with each small victory came the reminder of the time he had lost. There were gaps in Lily's life that Jacob could never fill. Birthdays he hadn't celebrated, milestones he hadn't witnessed, tears he hadn't wiped away. He carried this weight with him, a constant reminder of the price he had paid for his ambition. One afternoon, as they sat in the park watching the ducks glide across the pond, Lily turned to Jacob with a question that caught him off guard. "Why didn't you come find us before?" she asked, her voice filled with innocent curiosity. Jacob's heart clenched at the question. He knew this moment would come, but he still wasn't fully prepared for it. "I didn't know you were out there, Lily," he said softly. "I didn't know I had someone so special waiting for me." Lily frowned, not fully understanding. "But Mommy knew," she said. "Didn't she tell you?" Jacob took a deep breath, his mind racing to find the right words. "Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes," he began carefully. "I made a big mistake by not staying in touch with your mommy. And because of that, I didn't know about you until now. But now that I do, I want to be here for you, for everything. Lily looked at him, her eyes searching his face, as if trying to gauge the truth of his words. Finally, she nodded, accepting his explanation in the simple way that children do. But Jacob could see that the question lingered, a shadow that would take time to fully dissipate. That evening, as they returned to Emily's apartment, Jacob felt a bittersweet sense of progress. He was slowly building a relationship with Lily, but he knew it would take much longer for her to fully trust him, and even longer to forgive him for the years he had missed. Emily, too, was cautiously optimistic. She saw the effort Jacob was making, the way he was genuinely trying to connect with their daughter. But she also knew that the wounds of the past were not so easily healed. They had begun to navigate a new path together, but it was fraught with uncertainty and unspoken fears. One night, after Lily had gone to bed, Jacob and Emily sat together in the living room, the quiet of the apartment enveloping them. Emily looked at Jacob, her expression thoughtful. "You're doing well with her," she said softly. "She's starting to trust you." Jacob nodded, but his eyes were filled with worry. "I just wish I could do more," he admitted. "I feel like I'm always playing catch-up, trying to make up for everything I missed." Emily reached out and placed her hand on his. "You can't change the past, Jacob," she said gently. "But you're here now, and that's what matters." "Lily sees that. I see that." Jacob squeezed her hand, grateful for her understanding. "I just want to do right by her, by both of you," he said quietly. "I don't want to let either of you down." Emily smiled, a small, hopeful smile. "We'll figure this out together," she said. "It's not going to be easy, but we'll find a way." As they sat together in the dim light of the living room, a sense of calm settled over Jacob. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was exactly where he needed to be, surrounded by the people who mattered most. And he knew that, no matter what challenges lay ahead, he was ready to face them, one day at a time. The morning sun filtered through the blinds of Jacob's penthouse, casting long shadows across the room. Jacob sat at his desk, staring blankly at his computer screen. The usual hum of productivity was absent, replaced by a deep, unsettling silence. His mind was consumed by the revelation Emily had shared, the betrayal by James, the man he had trusted implicitly for years. Jacob had always prided himself on his ability to read people, to judge character with precision. But this was a betrayal of the highest order, and it had come from someone he considered more than just an employee. James had been his confidant, his right-hand man, someone Jacob had relied on through every major decision of his career. And now, the trust he had placed in him felt like a cruel joke. Jacob knew what he had to do. He had been avoiding it, hoping that maybe, just maybe, there was some misunderstanding. But deep down, he knew Emily was telling the truth. And now, he had to face it. Taking a deep breath, Jacob reached for his phone and dialed James's number. It rang a few times before James picked up, his voice as smooth and professional as ever. "Good morning, Mr. Wallace. What can I do for you today?" Jacob's grip tightened on the phone, his voice cold and controlled. "James, I need to see you in my office." "Now." There was a brief pause on the other end. Then James replied, "Of course, I'll be there in 10 minutes." Jacob ended the call and leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He had gone over this confrontation in his head a dozen times, but now that it was imminent, he wasn't sure how it would play out. How do you confront someone who has been lying to you for years? Someone who has shaped the very course of your life with deceit? 10 minutes later, there was a knock at the door. Jacob's heart pounded in his chest as he called out, "Come in." James entered, his usual confident demeanor intact. He smiled as he approached Jacob's desk, but there was a hint of curiosity in his eyes, as if he could sense that something was off. "You wanted to see me, Mr. Wallace?" Jacob stood, his gaze fixed on James. "Close the door," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. James hesitated, then did as he was told. He turned back to Jacob, his expression cautious. "What's this about?" Jacob walked around his desk, stopping just a few feet from James. He looked at him, really looked at him, searching for any sign of remorse or guilt. But James's face remained impassive, a mask of professional detachment. "Emily Collins," Jacob said, his voice steady but low. "Do you remember her?" James blinked, clearly taken aback by the question. Emily Collins? Yes, of course. She was someone you were involved with years ago, right? Jacob nodded, his eyes narrowing. She told me something interesting recently. She told me that you interfered in our relationship, that you lied to her, manipulated her into believing I didn't care. James's expression faltered for the briefest moment, but he quickly regained his composure. Mr. Wallace, Don't, Jacob interrupted, his voice sharp. Don't lie to me, James. Not now. The room fell into a tense silence, the air between them thick with unspoken accusations. Jacob could feel his anger bubbling just beneath the surface, but he forced himself to stay calm, to keep control. Tell me the truth, Jacob demanded. Did you sabotage my relationship with Emily? James looked away, his jaw clenched. For a long moment, he said nothing, and Jacob's heart sank. The silence was all the confirmation he needed. I did what I thought was best for you, James finally said, his voice tight. You were on the brink of something great, Jacob. Your career was taking off, and I couldn't let anything get in the way of that. Not even a relationship that was clearly distracting you. Jacob felt a wave of disbelief wash over him. You took it upon yourself to decide what was best for me? He asked, his voice shaking with anger. You had no right, James. No right to interfere in my life like that. James met his gaze, his expression defiant. I was protecting you. You were too blinded by your feelings to see that Emily was holding you back. I did what needed to be done to keep you on track. Jacob couldn't believe what he was hearing. The man who had been by his side for years, the man he had trusted with everything, had betrayed him in the most personal way possible. And worse, he didn't even seem to regret it. You destroyed something that was important to me, Jacob said, his voice low and filled with barely contained fury. You made me believe that my career was the only thing that mattered. And in doing so, you took away something I can never get back. James's face hardened. I was saving you from making a mistake, he said firmly. And look where you are now, Jacob. You're one of the most successful men in the world. Do you really think you would have achieved all of this if you'd been tied down in a relationship? Jacob stared at him, the weight of James's betrayal pressing down on him like a physical force. This isn't just about success, James, he said, his voice trembling with emotion. It's about the life I could have had, the family I could have been a part of. You took that from me. James's expression finally softened, a flicker of something resembling regret passing through his eyes. I thought I was doing the right thing, he said quietly. I never meant to hurt you, Jacob. I only wanted to see you succeed. Jacob shook his head, the anger in his chest turning to something colder, something more final. You were supposed to have my back, James, but you didn't trust me to make my own decisions. You betrayed me. James looked down, the weight of Jacob's words sinking in. I'm sorry, he whispered, but Jacob could hear the doubt in his voice, the lingering belief that he had done the right thing. Jacob took a step back, distancing himself from the man he had once considered a friend. You need to leave, he said, his voice devoid of emotion. Pack your things and go. You're fired. James looked up, his eyes wide with shock. Jacob, please. Now, Jacob said, cutting him off. There was no room for negotiation, no room for forgiveness. The damage had been done, and there was no going back. James hesitated for a moment, then nodded, his shoulders slumping in defeat. He turned and walked out of the office, the door closing behind him with a soft click that echoed through the silent room. Jacob stood there, alone in the aftermath of the confrontation, his emotions a tangled mess. He had always believed that success was worth any sacrifice, but now he wasn't so sure. He had lost so much: time, relationships, trust. And for what? A life of wealth and power that now felt hollow and meaningless. As the reality of what had just happened settled over him, Jacob felt a crushing sense of loss. He had built his life on a foundation of ambition and drive, but in doing so, he had let go of the things that truly mattered. And now, he was left to pick up the pieces of a life he no longer recognized. But even in the midst of the pain, there was a glimmer of hope. He still had a chance to build something real with Lily and Emily. He still had a chance to be the man he should have been all along. Jacob walked over to the window, looking out at the city skyline. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the buildings below. It was a new beginning. He realized a chance to start over, to make amends for the mistakes of the past. And this time, he was determined not to let anything stand in his way. The days following James's departure were a time of reflection for Jacob. His office felt emptier without the familiar presence of his once trusted assistant, but it also felt lighter, as if a shadow had been lifted. Jacob knew that the real work wasn't in his company or his empire. It was in the relationships he had neglected for so long. He spent more time at Emily's apartment, showing up after work with dinner in hand, or arriving on weekends to take Lily to the park. Each visit was a step forward, a brick in the bridge he was trying to rebuild between himself and the life he had almost lost. One Saturday morning, as autumn leaves fluttered to the ground, Jacob arrived at Emily's place with a nervous energy he hadn't felt in years. He had been planning this day for a while, hoping it would be a turning point. Lily was sitting at the kitchen table, munching on cereal while flipping through a picture book. When she saw Jacob, her face lit up with a shy smile. "Hey, Lily," Jacob greeted her, setting a paper bag filled with pastries on the counter. "I brought some breakfast." Lily's eyes widened at the sight of the bag. "Are there cinnamon rolls?" she asked, her voice filled with hope. Jacob grinned. "I wouldn't forget those. They're your favorite, right?" Lily nodded enthusiastically, already reaching for the bag. Emily entered the room just then, a warm smile on her face. "You're spoiling her," she teased, but there was no real reproach in her voice. Jacob shrugged, his expression playful. "That's my job now, isn't it?" Emily laughed softly, but her eyes held a seriousness that Jacob didn't miss. After Lily had devoured her cinnamon roll, Emily suggested they all go to the park. It had become a ritual of sorts, an easy, neutral ground where they could spend time together without the weight of the past pressing down on them. As they walked through the park, the crisp autumn air nipping at their cheeks, Lily ran ahead to chase a group of pigeons. Jacob and Emily strolled behind, the leaves crunching under their feet. "She's really starting to warm up to you," Emily observed, glancing over at Jacob. "It's good to see." Jacob nodded, his gaze following Lily as she laughed and twirled among the falling leaves. "I'm trying," he said quietly. "I know I have a lot to make up for." Emily stopped walking and turned to face him. "Jacob, you're doing well," she said, her voice earnest. "You can't expect everything to be perfect right away. Building a relationship with her takes time, but you're showing up, and that's what matters." Jacob looked into Emily's eyes, feeling a rush of gratitude for her understanding. I want to be the father she deserves," he confessed. "I want to be the man you can rely on." Emily smiled softly, reaching out to take his hand. "You're already on your way," she said. "But you need to stop beating yourself up over the past. What's important is what you do now, with the time you have." Jacob squeezed her hand, the warmth of her touch grounding him. He knew she was right, but the weight of his mistakes still lingered in his mind. He wanted to be there for both Emily and Lily, but he also feared that the damage was too deep to fully repair. They continued walking, eventually finding a bench where they could sit and watch Lily play. The park was a haven of calm, the trees dressed in shades of gold and crimson, the air filled with the scent of earth and wood. Jacob cherished these moments of peace, where the noise of the city and the noise in his head seemed to fade away. As they sat together, Jacob turned to Emily, his voice tentative. "Emily, I've been thinking a lot about what you said about us, about how we might rebuild something." Emily looked at him, her expression unreadable. "What are you saying, Jacob?" Jacob took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "I know things are complicated between us, and I know I hurt you, hurt us by the choices I made. But I don't want to live in the past anymore. I want to move forward, with you and with Lily. I want to see where this can go." Emily's eyes softened, but there was a flicker of hesitation. "Jacob, I've spent years trying to move on from what happened between us," she began. "And seeing you again with Lily, it's brought back a lot of memories, some good, some painful. I need to be sure that you're in this for the right reasons, that you're not just trying to fix what's broken because you feel guilty." Jacob felt the weight of her words, but he met her gaze steadily. "I'm not perfect, Emily. I've made more mistakes than I can count. But this isn't about guilt. It's about realizing what I had, what I lost, and what I still want. I don't expect you to just forget the past. but I'm asking for a chance to show you that I've changed, that I'm ready to be the man you and Lily deserve. Emily studied him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face for sincerity. I believe you want to change, Jacob, she said finally. But this won't be easy. We can take it slow, see how things go. But I need to protect Lily. She's my priority. Jacob nodded, his heart swelling with a mixture of hope and trepidation. She's my priority too, he said softly. I'm in this for the long haul, Emily. Whatever it takes. A small smile curved Emily's lips, and for the first time, Jacob felt like the walls between them were beginning to crumble. It wasn't a declaration of love or a promise of a future together, but it was a beginning, a fragile, tentative step towards something more. Just then, Lily came running over, her cheeks flushed with excitement. "Mommy, Daddy, look what I found," she exclaimed, holding up a shiny, red leaf. Jacob's heart skipped a beat at the word Daddy. It was the first time Lily had called him that, and the sound of it was both thrilling and terrifying. He smiled at her, his voice choked with emotion. "That's beautiful, Lily," he said, his eyes shining. Emily's hand tightened around his, and Jacob knew in that moment that he had been given a gift, one he was determined not to squander. He still had a long way to go, but for the first time in years, he felt like he was on the right path. And with Emily and Lily by his side, he knew he had a reason to keep moving forward, one step at a time. The weeks that followed were filled with cautious optimism as Jacob, Emily, and Lily slowly began to build a new rhythm together. Jacob's visits became more frequent, and the time he spent with Lily deepened their bond. There was laughter and warmth, moments that Jacob had never thought he would experience again. But with every step forward, there were also moments of doubt and fear, especially for Emily. One evening, as the first signs of winter began to creep into the air, Jacob arrived at Emily's apartment with a bouquet of lilies. A subtle gesture, but one that carried more meaning than he could express in words. When Emily opened the door, her eyes softened at the sight of the flowers, but there was still a lingering caution in her gaze. "Lilies," she said with a small smile, taking the bouquet from him. "You remembered." Jacob nodded, his expression earnest. "I remember a lot of things, Emily, more than I ever let on." Emily's smile faltered slightly, and she turned to place the flowers in a vase on the kitchen table. "Lily's in her room," she said, avoiding his gaze. "She'll be excited to see you." Jacob could sense the tension in her voice, the way she was holding something back. He followed her into the kitchen, leaning against the counter as she arranged the flowers. "What's on your mind?" he asked gently. Emily hesitated, her hands pausing over the bouquet. She took a deep breath before turning to face him, her expression conflicted. "Jacob, I've been thinking a lot about us, about what we're doing here." Jacob's heart sank slightly, but he forced himself to stay calm. "And what have you been thinking?" Emily met his gaze, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear. "I'm scared," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I'm scared that this is all too good to be true, that you'll wake up one day and realize this isn't the life you want." Jacob's chest tightened with the weight of her words. He stepped closer to her, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Emily, I know I've let you down before, and I understand why you're scared, but I'm not going anywhere. Being with you and Lily, it's what I want more than anything." Emily's eyes glistened with unshed tears, but she shook her head, as if trying to shake off the doubt that clung to her. "I want to believe you, Jacob," she whispered, "but I've spent so many years protecting Lily from disappointment. I can't afford to be wrong about this." Jacob reached out, gently cupping her face in his hands. "You won't be wrong," he said firmly. "I'm committed to this, Emily. To you, to Lily, to us. I know it's going to take time, and I'm willing to be patient. But please, don't push me away out of fear." Emily closed her eyes, leaning into his touch as if drawing strength from it. When she opened them again, there was a flicker of resolve in her gaze. "I won't push you away," she said softly. "But I need to take this slow, Jacob. I need to know that you're here for the right reasons." Jacob nodded, understanding the depth of what she was asking. "I'll prove it to you, every day if I have to. Whatever it takes, Emily." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of Lily's footsteps as she came bounding into the kitchen, her face lighting up at the sight of Jacob. "Daddy," she exclaimed, running over to him. Jacob's heart swelled at the sound of the word. He scooped Lily up into his arms, holding her close as if she were the most precious thing in the world. "Hey, sweetie," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I missed you." Lily beamed at him, her small arms wrapped around his neck. "I missed you too," she said, her voice muffled against his shoulder. Emily watched them, her expression softening as she took in the scene. It was moments like this that gave her hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, they could build something real and lasting. As the evening wore on, the three of them settled into a comfortable routine. They had dinner together, laughing over Lily's stories from school, and then they spent time playing board games in the living room. It was a simple evening, but it was filled with a warmth that had been missing from Jacob's life for far too long. Later, after Lily had gone to bed, Jacob and Emily sat together on the couch, the quiet of the apartment wrapping around them like a blanket. Jacob reached out, taking Emily's hand in his thumb gently stroking her knuckles. "You know," Jacob began, his voice soft, "I've been thinking a lot about the future, about what it could look like if you'd let me be a part of it." Emily looked at him, her heart pounding in her chest. "What are you saying, Jacob?" "I'm saying that I want this," Jacob said, his eyes filled with sincerity. "I want to build a life with you and Lily. I want to be there for every milestone, every challenge, every joy. But I also know that I need to earn that right. So let's take it one day at a time, but let's do it together." Emily's breath hitched in her throat, and for a moment, she couldn't find the words to respond. But as she looked into Jacob's eyes, she saw the truth of his intentions, the depth of his commitment. She nodded, a small, tentative smile curving her lips. "Together," she agreed, her voice barely above a whisper. Jacob's heart soared at her response, and he pulled her into his arms, holding her close. For the first time in years, he felt like he was exactly where he belonged, wrapped in the warmth of a family he had almost lost. As they sat together in the quiet of the evening, Jacob knew that there would still be challenges ahead. The road to rebuilding their lives wouldn't be easy, and there would be moments of doubt and fear. But he also knew that he was ready to face whatever came their way, because he wasn't doing it alone. He had found his way back to Emily and Lily, and he wasn't going to let go. Together, they would build something stronger, something lasting. And no matter what obstacles lay ahead, Jacob knew that this time, he wouldn't let anything stand in the way of the future he wanted with them. Winter had fully settled in, blanketing the city in a soft, shimmering layer of snow. The holiday season was in full swing, with twinkling lights adorning every window and the scent of pine and cinnamon lingering in the air. For the first time in what felt like forever, Jacob was looking forward to Christmas, not for the lavish parties or high-stakes business deals, but for the simple joy of spending it with Emily and Lily. Jacob had invited them to his penthouse for Christmas Eve, a decision that marked a significant step in their evolving relationship. Emily had been hesitant at first, wary of the grandeur that his home represented, but Jacob assured her that this was about them, not the world he had once immersed himself in. As the evening approached, Jacob found himself bustling around the kitchen, something he hadn't done in years. He had insisted on cooking dinner himself, wanting to show Emily and Lily that he was committed to every aspect of their life together, even the little things. The doorbell rang, pulling Jacob from his thoughts. His heart raced with a mix of excitement and nervousness as he wiped his hands on a dish towel and headed to the door. When he opened it, the sight that greeted him took his breath away. Emily stood there, looking radiant in a simple red dress, her cheeks flushed from the cold. Lily was by her side, bundled up in a thick coat and scarf, her eyes sparkling with excitement. In her small hands, she held a wrapped gift, the paper adorned with bright, festive patterns. "Merry Christmas," Jacob greeted them, his voice warm and sincere. "Merry Christmas, Daddy," Lily exclaimed, throwing her arms around him as soon as she stepped inside. Jacob lifted her into his arms, holding her close as Emily watched with a soft smile. "Smells good in here," Emily remarked, her eyes scanning the penthouse, which Jacob had decorated with far more care than usual. A tall Christmas tree stood in the corner, adorned with ornaments and lights that twinkled softly in the dim light. "I might have gone a little overboard," Jacob admitted, a sheepish grin on his face. I wanted everything to be perfect. Emily stepped closer, reaching out to adjust his tie, a playful glint in her eyes. You're doing just fine, Jacob. They settled into the evening with a sense of ease that had once seemed impossible. Dinner was a warm, intimate affair, filled with laughter and stories. Lily chattered away, her joy infectious as she told Jacob about her favorite holiday traditions. Jacob listened intently, savoring every moment, every word. After dinner, they gathered around the Christmas tree to open presents. Jacob watched with a mixture of happiness and relief as Lily tore into her gifts, her face lighting up with each one. He had been nervous about whether his choices would resonate with her, but the squeals of delight that filled the room quickly put his fears to rest. Finally, there was only one gift left under the tree. It was a small, unassuming box wrapped in simple paper, but it was the one that Jacob had been most anxious about. He handed it to Emily, his heart pounding as she looked at him with curiosity. "What's this?" she asked, turning the box over in her hands. "Just something I've been thinking about for a while," Jacob said, his voice tinged with nerves. "Open it." Emily carefully unwrapped the box, lifting the lid to reveal a delicate silver necklace. The pendant was shaped like a small, intertwined heart, and inside the box, there was a note written in Jacob's handwriting. "For the family I almost lost, but will never let go of again." Emily's breath caught in her throat as she read the note, her eyes filling with tears. She looked up at Jacob, her expression a mixture of surprise and deep emotion. "Jacob, it's beautiful," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Jacob stepped closer, taking the necklace from the box and gently clasping it around her neck. "You and Lily are everything to me," he said softly, his eyes locking with hers. "I spent so many years focused on the wrong things, but you've both shown me what really matters. I'm all in, Emily, for you, for Lily, for us. This is where I want to be, now and always." Emily reached up, her fingers brushing the pendant as she looked into Jacob's eyes. There was a vulnerability there, a raw honesty that she hadn't seen before. She realized in that moment that he meant every word. He had changed, not just for her, but for himself, for the future they could build together. "I believe you, Jacob," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And I want this too. I want to see where this can go, as long as we're in it together." Jacob felt a surge of relief and joy, emotions he hadn't allowed himself to fully embrace until now. He pulled her into his arms, holding her close as Lily watched, her eyes wide with innocent understanding. "This is the best Christmas ever," Lily declared, her voice breaking the emotional silence. She ran over to them, wrapping her small arms around both Jacob and Emily, her presence a grounding force that reminded them of the beautiful, fragile life they were building. Jacob looked down at Lily, his heart overflowing with love. "It really is," he agreed, his voice filled with a deep, abiding warmth. As they stood together, wrapped in each other's embrace, Jacob knew that this was just the beginning. There would be challenges ahead, moments of doubt and fear, but he was no longer the man who ran from those things. He had found something worth fighting for, something worth holding on to, and he wasn't going to let it slip through his fingers again. Together, they would face whatever the future held, knowing that they had already overcome the greatest obstacles. The road to this moment had been long and winding, filled with pain and regret, but it had also led them here, to a place of love, understanding, and hope. And as the first snowflakes of the night began to fall outside the window, Jacob realized that he was finally home. Not in a building, not in a career, but in the hearts of the two people who meant everything to him. It was a new beginning, a fresh start, and he was ready to embrace it with all the love and commitment he had. For the first time in a long time, Jacob Wallace knew that he was exactly where he was meant to be, with the family he had almost lost, but had finally found again. And this time, he was never letting go. If you enjoyed this heartwarming story about overcoming challenges and family love, don't forget to like the video, comment on what touched you the most, and subscribe to the channel. Stay tuned for our next exciting story.